Each culture has their monsters. For the ancient Greeks and Romans, we can find tales about the Chimera, a creature from Asia Minor which had 3 different animal heads and breathed fire. Or we could find the Minotaur, trapped in a maze and which was satiated with human sacrifices which it consumed. If we move our search a little further north to Scandinavia, we can find tales about the Kraken, a squid-like beast that lived off the coast between Norway and Greenland. It would hide beneath the waves and wait to capsize a ship with its massive tentacles, or create a vortex and sink them down to the ocean floor. Or in Britain, we have stories about the basilisk, a serpent-like creature which could kill its victims with only a stare, and the dragon, a massive lizard-like creature that could breathe fire. These monsters are just a few mentioned in the European canon, and which leave out innumerable others from countries the world over. However, as different as they are from one another, they all share something in common. No matter where in the world we find ourselves, or no matter what time we find ourselves in, wherever there's been a human civilization or culture, there are bound to be monsters which exist in the minds of all its members. Whether they be chimeras, basilisks, fairies, elves, angels, or demons, no culture would be complete without its canon of mythical monsters. However, most of the time, these monsters are confined to ancient fantastical beliefs, and the names of these creatures don't strike us with the same fear that so overcame our ancestors. There are no seafarers who cower in their cabins at the thought of the Kraken in the depths of the ocean, waiting to ensnare the boat with its tentacles and sink it below the waves. There are no fabled heroes who seek the dragon and rescue a damsel in distress from the tallest tower and claim the treasure which it's said to safeguard. There are none of the monsters that our ancestors wrote literature about and must have told stories about around the fire on a cold winter night. It seems as though, in our modern age of science and reason, all the stories about monsters have become mere chimeras, and our fantastical beliefs have been explained with logic. However, there is still a monster in our modern age, and one more deadly and sinister than any of the others we've just mentioned. A monster that's not confined to the history books, but is still alive and breathing. What could such a monster be? That monster, dear friends, is that we have no monster at all. That might strike us as for the best. After all, these civilizations did treat monsters as real, and that there would be consequences if one did something wrong or crossed a cultural boundary. Now that we think such monsters don't exist, or have mostly been relegated to a few fanatics that still hold faith in the existence of the Loch Ness Monster or the Sasquatch, we can rest safe with the knowledge that none of them will come for us in the night and drag us away into the darkness. It's an easier life, where our security and freedom has been hard won on the battleground between fanaticism and reason. However, for our mustachioed friend Friedrich Nietzsche, this is the cause of a sickness with our modern age, and that our greatest weakness as a culture is that we have no monsters at all. In fact, it could even be said that our distinct lack of monsters has become something much more monstrous that it has become a monster, and one that has swept around the world and infected nearly all countries on Earth. What should we call such a beast? I think we should content ourselves with the label given by Nietzsche himself. This monster is the monster of nihilism. Before we can fully discuss the ramifications of this modern monster, we need some background on Nietzsche. Although Nietzsche often wrote about nihilism in his works, he was the last human on Earth that could be called a nihilist. In fact, Nietzsche believed nihilism the single most detestable and corrosive idea that can infect modern European society. If such a view ever became common in the mind of the Western man, it would spell the downfall of our culture and civilization, with disastrous results. But where could such a nihilism originate? For the answer to that, we need to travel back in time to Nietzsche's favourite civilization, the ancient Greeks. For all their virtues of culture and art, it's fair to assume that Nietzsche didn't like Socrates all that much. In The Birth of Tragedy, for example, Nietzsche full-out murders Socrates for heralding the downfall of the Greek culture, with his views that logic and reason could make even the most puzzling ideas in the universe intelligible. Socrates condemned Greek tragedy, which Nietzsche so adored, because it didn't tell the truth, and its complex dialogue and metaphor was just a mere illusion and nothing more. Tragedy was something to fill our time, when according to Socrates, we should be spending that limited time on a steadfast search for the truth. The careful balance between the ordered Apollonian influence and the chaotic Dionysian influence on tragedy, which had blossomed in such works as Oedipus, Prometheus, and Antigone, was shattered and broken as Socrates tore down the illusions that surrounded them to find the truth hidden underneath, destroyed the film sets and revealed the camera trickery that was happening in the background. This search for truth has resulted in reason and logic, and eventually the scientific method itself, placed on a throne that it has retained ever since Socrates. Socrates, therefore, can be viewed as the fulcrum on which our modern world turns, and not much has changed since he shook the foundations of our cosmos over 2 millennia ago. This continued through the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment. In Nietzsche's own time, this seismic ripple had also occurred with Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution that had become more accepted. The result of all these shifts in thought was that traditional Judeo-Christian values, the values that had ordered and structured human society since Plato, were under intense scrutiny. Eventually, this tectonic activity meant that some of the Earth's crust was to be sunk into the mantle, and with the identity that science had carved into the minds of all Westerners since the Greeks, it was religion that had to explode. Quite famously, Nietzsche wrote about God's death. However, this was not something he took lightly. The death of God was also the death of all human values, and the stage was set for Europe to be plunged headfirst into nihilism. If it wasn't already clear, Nietzsche thought nihilism was a terrible fate, and even predicted, along with Dostoevsky, that nihilism would herald the most vicious wars the world had ever seen, and a cursory look back at the last century has proven them basically correct. For Nietzsche, the ultimate question was, what now? For Nietzsche, the answer was simple: bugger all. There's nothing that can be done because our culture has already been infected with the seeds of reason and logic, which have since grown into the oak tree that is nihilism. The monster that Nietzsche had diagnosed all that time ago has claimed its victims. However, this isn't to say that an answer hasn't been found already in the ancient Greek civilization. Nietzsche found that the Greek gods, such as Zeus, Ares, and Dionysus, were all ideals to strive towards. Zeus, for example, was strength, Ares was skilled in wartime, Dionysus was festivity. All these traits were traits that Nietzsche identified as master morality and were found in the upper classes in society. On the other hand, the classes that were oppressed came to be known under the banner of slave morality. This morality, such as the Christians in ancient Rome, was characterized first and foremost by a bitter and hateful resentment towards the upper classes, what Nietzsche called ressentiment. Even though Christianity was valuable in the morality it bestowed on the West, this morality was fundamentally a slave morality, created to rationalize suffering. So, our modern civilization is flawed. It's founded upon a slave morality, and this foundation has eroded and decayed, which has left us with nihilism. All our values have been destroyed, and there's no hope that we could create them anew. We've battled with a cruel and evil monster, and we've created a monster ourselves. We have stared into the abyss, and the abyss has most definitely stared into us. So what are we to do? Nietzsche argues that even though our society has been written off, the best we can do is attempt to create a society in which a master morality could be nurtured. The humans in this society would have strong wills and would create their own values according to their wills. They would make their own meaning and rise above life to conquer all. In fact, Nietzsche argues that these wouldn't be humans at all. Rather, they would be Übermensch or superhumans. In this new world, there would be no such thing as nihilism, this modern melancholia that has so infected us all today. The Earth may not be the center of the universe, but it would be the center of meaning and value in an otherwise desolate and dejected void. Then, and only then, could we finally say that the monster we created has been slain, once and for all. The Book of Nature is one written by the universe, and it's also written into you with mathematics and stardust. The fact that we exist, let alone have conscious experience in this universe where atoms are desolate and dead, is a fact that must necessarily transcend the boundaries of reason and science, and demand to be understood in the language of miracles and magic. To exist is such a weird and wonderful experience that in order for one to be a nihilist, one must have read the book of nature with a bad translation. Of course, science is and will continue to be a useful tool, and one that can discover knowledge about the universe we find ourselves in, this conundrum in which we're the enigmas to be solved. However, as Nietzsche reminds us, we must remember that science is an instrument, and to think that we can apply this instrument to the totality of existence is to be obsequious to our reason and to make a horrible transgression in our understanding of the universe. When science works for its intended use, it can provide a marvelous insight to the inner workings of the world, but when used incorrectly, it can drain the colour from our lived experience and render the whole cosmos as something without meaning or value. We need this colour to thrive as a species, to become the superhumans that Nietzsche so desperately wants us to become, just as we need the monsters which support the universe and all our civilizations and cultures upon their backs. So the next time you're alone in the house, or hear a mysterious noise that you can't explain, remember this: we need those monsters a little more than we realise. Thank you very much for watching, peace and love, and I'll see you in the next video.